A chip, roughly the size of your palm, just claims something that should genuinely alarm every major technology company on Earth, including the ones building America's most advanced artificial intelligence systems. It claims to run certain AI workloads 1,000 times faster than NVIDIA's most powerful graphics processors, and it was built in China. Whether or not that exact number holds up under independent scrutiny, the announcement alone has sent a wave of concern through boardrooms, research labs, and government agencies across the United States. Today, we are breaking down exactly what this Chinese quantum chip actually is, why American experts and companies are taking it so seriously, and what it reveals about a technology race that most people have not been paying nearly enough attention to. Stick around, because this story connects semiconductor policy, national security, and the very foundation of how future computing power might actually get built. Let's start with the chip itself, because understanding what it actually does is essential before we get into why it has people worried. The chip was developed by a Chinese research organization called the Chip Hub for Integrated Photonics Explore, often shortened to ChipX, and it has been described by its own developers as the world's first scalable industrial-grade quantum computing chip. According to reporting from the South China Morning Post, the chip's creators claim it can perform certain artificial intelligence tasks 1,000 times faster than NVIDIA's graphics processing units, and they say it is already being deployed in real industries, including aerospace and finance. That is a genuinely bold claim, and we will get into exactly how seriously to take it in a moment. But first, it helps to understand what makes this chip technically different from the quantum computers most people picture when they hear that term, since the underlying architecture here diverges quite a bit from the systems that have dominated quantum computing headlines up until now. This is not a traditional quantum computer built around superconducting circuits chilled to temperatures colder than outer space, which is the approach companies like IBM and Google have primarily pursued. Instead, ChipX built what is called a photonic quantum chip, meaning it uses particles of light, called photons, to carry and process quantum information instead of using matter-based components. This distinction matters enormously for practical reasons. Light does not take up physical space the way traditional electrical components do. It does not generate nearly as much heat, and it can travel through a system far more efficiently than electricity moving through traditional circuitry. Given that power consumption inside modern AI data centers has become an enormous and rapidly growing problem, a computing approach that sidesteps a huge portion of that heat and energy cost carries obvious appeal, and well beyond just the raw speed claims being reported. To really understand why energy efficiency has become such an urgent concern across the entire AI industry right now, it helps to look at the numbers driving that anxiety. Modern AI data centers have grown into some of the most power-hungry facilities on the planet, with some individual campuses now requiring as much electricity as an entire mid-sized city just to keep their servers running and cooled. That demand has strained power grids, driven up electricity prices in some regions, and forced technology companies to sign massive long-term energy contracts, including deals for nuclear power, specifically to guarantee enough reliable capacity for their expanding AI operations. Any computing technology that could meaningfully reduce that energy burden, even partially, represents a genuinely enormous financial and operational opportunity, which is exactly why photonic approaches, quantum or otherwise, have attracted so much serious investment attention from major technology companies over the past several years, regardless of which country happens to be leading on any individual breakthrough. The physical design of this chip is also genuinely impressive from a pure engineering standpoint. ChipX packed more than 1,000 individual optical components onto a single 6-inch silicon wafer, using what is described as a monolithic design, meaning all of these components are built directly into one unified piece rather than being assembled from separate parts afterward. That level of integration is a big part of why these chips are reportedly so compact compared to traditional quantum computing hardware, which often requires large, room-sized supporting infrastructure just to keep a small number of qubits stable and operational. According to the reporting, systems built around these chips can reportedly be deployed in as little as 2 weeks compared to roughly 6 months for more traditional quantum computing systems, and the chip's design allegedly allows multiple units to work together in parallel, similar to how AI GPUs are clustered together today, with deployments potentially scaling toward 1 million qubits of combined processing power. That last comparison, 2 weeks versus 6 months for deployment, deserves a moment of its own attention, because it speaks to a practical business advantage that often gets overshadowed by flashier, raw performance claims. In any emerging technology field, the company or country that can actually deploy working systems fastest often ends up gathering more real-world usage data, identifying more practical problems, and iterating toward genuinely useful applications faster than a competitor, stuck waiting months just to get a single system operational. even if ChipX's underlying performance claims eventually prove more modest than the headline thousand-fold figure suggests. A genuine advantage in deployment speed alone could translate into a meaningful head start when it comes to real-world commercial adoption, simply because businesses and research institutions can start experimenting with the technology and finding practical use cases for it that much sooner. Now here is where it becomes important to add some healthy skepticism into this story, because bold claims in the quantum computing space have a well-earned reputation for not always holding up once independent researchers get a chance to properly examine them. Quantum computing, as a field, has seen plenty of previous announcements framed as revolutionary breakthroughs, only for outside experts to later point out that the specific problem being solved faster was an artificially constructed benchmark with little real-world relevance, rather than a genuinely useful, broadly applicable computational task. Critics examining this specific claim have raised a similar concern, noting that quantum computers today remain genuinely useful for only an extremely narrow slice of computing problems, things like certain types of cryptographic factoring, while remaining unsuitable or actually inferior to conventional computers for the overwhelming majority of everyday computational tasks that businesses and consumers actually rely on. This distinction between artificially constructed benchmarks and genuinely useful real-world performance is one of the most persistently misunderstood aspects of quantum computing coverage across nearly every major announcement in recent years, regardless of which country or company happens to be making the claim. A quantum computer can genuinely, legitimately outperform even the most powerful classical supercomputer on Earth at one very specific, carefully chosen mathematical problem, while still being completely useless, or even actively worse, at the vast majority of computational tasks that businesses and everyday applications actually depend on. This happens because quantum computers exploit fundamentally different mathematical properties that only provide a meaningful advantage for certain narrow categories of problems, ones involving specific types of pattern searching, optimization, or simulation of quantum systems themselves. Claiming a thousand-fold speedup on an AI workload sounds impressive, precisely because AI has become the dominant technology story of this entire decade. But without knowing exactly which specific AI task was being measured and how representative that task actually is of the broader range of AI workloads companies run every single day, it remains genuinely difficult for outside observers to know how much practical significance that specific number actually carries. There is also a more technical distinction worth understanding here, one that some observers felt got blurred in the initial coverage of this announcement. Photonic computing and quantum computing are related concepts, but they are not automatically the same thing. Using light instead of electricity to move and process information is, on its own, a meaningful engineering innovation that could improve conventional computing efficiency, regardless of whether true quantum effects are involved. Genuine quantum computing specifically relies on quantum mechanical properties like superposition and entanglement to perform certain calculations in fundamentally different ways than any classical computer, whether that classical computer happens to use electricity or light to move its information around. Some technical observers following this story argued that the reporting around ChipX's chip did not always clearly separate these two distinct concepts, meaning some of the excitement and some of the concern may be based on a slightly blurred understanding of exactly what technology is actually being described. This kind of terminology confusion happens more often than you might expect, even in otherwise careful technology journalism, largely because the underlying science genuinely is complex enough that shorthand explanations inevitably lose some important nuance along the way. A photonic chip that simply moves information using light instead of electricity is still fundamentally operating on classical binary computing principles underneath, meaning it processes information as definite ones and zeros, just carried by photons rather than electrons. A true quantum photonic chip, by contrast, would need to actually harness quantum mechanical properties like superposition, where information can exist in multiple states simultaneously to earn the label quantum computing in the strict technical sense that physicists use the term. Some of the public confusion and, frankly, some of the alarm surrounding this specific announcement likely stems from readers reasonably assuming that any headline containing the word quantum automatically refers to a fully quantum mechanical system, when the underlying reality of exactly what ChipX has built may sit somewhere on a more nuanced spectrum, between purely classical photonic computing and true quantum information processing. Even accounting for that healthy skepticism, though, there are very real reasons why this development is generating serious concern within American technology and policy circles, and they go well beyond just the raw performance claims. The first and most obvious reason involves current production capacity. According to the reporting, the facilities responsible for manufacturing these chips are producing around 12,000 silicon wafers per year, with each wafer yielding approximately 350 individual chips. Compared to the massive scale of a typical modern semiconductor fabrication facility, that is a relatively modest production volume. But modest today does not mean modest tomorrow, especially when a government treats a specific technology as a strategic national priority and is willing to pour sustained investment into scaling up production capacity over time. History offers plenty of relevant precedent here worth remembering before dismissing modest current production numbers as inherently insignificant. Solar panel manufacturing, electric vehicle battery production, and advanced telecommunications equipment all followed remarkably similar early trajectories, starting with relatively small, expensive, limited-scale production runs that skeptical Western observers frequently dismissed as unlikely to ever achieve genuine cost-competitive scale. In each of those cases, sustained Chinese government investment combined with aggressive private sector execution eventually drove production volumes up dramatically, while costs came down just as dramatically, ultimately reshaping entire global industries within a relatively short number of years. That pattern does not guarantee the exact same outcome will repeat itself with quantum chip manufacturing specifically, since the underlying technical challenges here are genuinely different and, in some ways, considerably harder than manufacturing solar panels or batteries. But it does explain precisely why American policymakers and technology executives tend to take early-stage Chinese manufacturing announcements more seriously than the current relatively modest production numbers might otherwise suggest on their own. And that brings us directly to the second, much bigger reason this story matters so much right now. China has explicitly placed quantum technology near the very top of its list of priority future industries in its current 5-year plan, treating it as a strategic pillar of national technological development rather than simply one interesting research area among many. That kind of top-down, sustained government prioritization tends to produce results over time, even when individual early breakthroughs turn out to be somewhat overstated or narrower in real-world application than initial headlines suggest, simply because sustained funding keeps multiple research teams and manufacturing efforts moving forward in parallel year after year. China has already built what independent trackers describe as the only 6-inch quantum chip production line in the country, specifically dedicated to superconducting quantum computing, operated by a company called Origin Quantum. And that company has continued shipping increasingly advanced systems, including a machine called Wukong 180 that reportedly houses 180 qubits on a single chip, with every major subsystem developed entirely in-house rather than relying on imported foreign components. Achieving that level of complete vertical self-sufficiency is significantly harder than it might initially sound, and it represents a deliberate, sustained strategic priority rather than something that happens naturally through ordinary market competition alone, where modern quantum computing systems require an enormous range of highly specialized components working together seamlessly, including ultra-precise measurement and control electronics, specialized cryogenic cooling systems, capable of reaching temperatures colder than deep space, and highly customized software stacks capable of translating classical computing instructions into signals a quantum processor can actually interpret and execute. Historically, even leading American and European quantum computing companies have relied on a global supply chain of specialized component suppliers scattered across multiple different countries to build their systems. A company achieving genuine end-to-end self-sufficiency across every one of these demanding subsystems signals a level of sustained domestic investment and coordinated industrial planning that goes well beyond what a single private company could realistically achieve entirely on its own without substantial sustained backing and strategic direction from a government treating the entire effort as a genuine national priority. That last detail, everything being developed in-house, is not a small footnote. It is actually central to understanding why the United States government has grown increasingly concerned about China's quantum progress specifically. For years, the United States has maintained export controls specifically designed to limit China's access to advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment and other technologies with potential military or strategic applications. Jose restrictions have clearly created real friction for Chinese quantum computing companies. Reporting has shown that firms like Origin Quantum have had to source specialized manufacturing equipment from non-American suppliers, including a mask aligner from a German company, specifically to work around these American restrictions. The fact that Chinese quantum companies have continued advancing their capabilities despite these barriers, rather than being effectively stopped by them, is precisely the kind of development that has fueled growing anxiety among American policymakers about whether current export control strategies are actually achieving their intended goal of slowing China's technological progress in this specific, strategically sensitive field. This tension sits at the heart of a genuinely difficult ongoing policy debate happening within American national security and technology circles right now. Export controls work reasonably well at slowing down a competitor's access to specific, narrowly defined pieces of technology, particularly when that technology depends on a small number of highly specialized manufacturers concentrated in just a handful of countries. But they work considerably less well at stopping a determined, well-resourced competitor from finding alternative suppliers, developing workaround solutions, or in some cases, accelerating investment into entirely different technical approaches that fall outside the specific scope of existing restrictions altogether. Some technology policy analysts have argued that overly broad or poorly targeted export controls can sometimes backfire in exactly this way, inadvertently motivating a restricted country to build more resilient, more self-sufficient domestic supply chains than it might have otherwise prioritized building if unrestricted access to foreign technology had simply remained available. Whether that dynamic is playing out specifically within China's quantum computing sector remains a matter of genuine debate among experts, but the mask aligner example alone demonstrates that current restrictions have not been airtight, and airtight enforcement across every possible workaround has proven consistently difficult to achieve in practice across nearly every major technology export control regime in recent history. This growing concern has already translated into concrete action from the American side as well, and understanding that response helps explain just how seriously this competition is being taken at the highest levels of government and industry. Earlier this year, the United States Department of Commerce announced letters of intent distributing just over $2 billion in funding under the CHIPS and Science Act, specifically aimed at supporting domestic quantum foundries and quantum computing companies. This funding was explicitly framed not simply as an economic development initiative, but as a matter of national security, reflecting how seriously officials now view quantum computing leadership as connected to broader questions of military and strategic advantage. 2 companies received the largest allocations under this specific initiative. GlobalFoundries received $375 million to establish a domestic quantum foundry capable of supporting multiple different hardware approaches, while IBM received a full $1 billion to build an entirely new subsidiary, dedicated specifically to producing quantum-grade superconducting wafers on American soil. In both cases, the federal government also took a minority equity stake in the receiving companies, and unusually underscores just how strategically important this technology has become in the eyes of American policymakers. That equity stake detail is worth sitting with for a moment, because it represents a meaningful departure from how the American government has traditionally supported private technology development, and it signals a genuine shift in strategic thinking at the highest levels of federal policymaking. For most of the past several decades, American federal support for emerging technology has generally flowed through research grants, tax incentives, or defense contracts, arrangements where the government provides funding without necessarily taking a direct ownership position in the companies receiving that support. Taking an actual equity stake, becoming a genuine financial stakeholder in a private company's success, represents a more aggressive, more direct form of industrial policy that echoes strategies more commonly associated with how other governments around the world, including China's own state-directed investment approach, have historically supported strategically important domestic industries. The fact that American policymakers have grown comfortable adopting a similarly direct approach specifically for quantum computing signals just how seriously this particular technology race is being treated at the highest levels of government, well beyond the more hands-off funding approaches typically applied to most other emerging technology sectors. Beyond a direct government funding, there is also an intensive, closely watched competitive evaluation process happening entirely within the American technology ecosystem, one specifically designed to determine which American quantum computing approaches actually deserve continued national investment and confidence. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, better known as DARPA, runs a program called the Quantum Benchmarking Initiative, specifically built to rigorously evaluate whether any quantum computing architecture can realistically achieve genuinely useful, commercially meaningful operation by the year 2033. Companies move through multiple demanding stages of technical evaluation, with only a small number of the strongest, most technically credible approaches advancing toward the final, most rigorous verification phase. Microsoft and PsiQuantum have both advanced into that most demanding final stage so far, representing very different technical approaches to building a quantum computer, while companies like Google, Quantum AI, Dirac, and Quandela continue working through earlier stages of this same evaluation pipeline. This entire process reflects something important about how the American side of this race is approaching the challenge. Rather than betting everything on a single technical approach, American quantum policy is deliberately spreading investment and evaluation across multiple competing hardware philosophies, precisely because nobody yet knows for certain which specific approach will ultimately prove most practical and most scalable for genuinely useful industrial-grade quantum computing. This diversified competitive approach reflects a broader philosophy about how the American technology ecosystem has traditionally approached uncertain, high-risk technology races. One that stands in interesting contrast to the more centralized top-down coordination China has employed toward its own quantum ambitions. Rather than a single government agency selecting one preferred technical approach and directing the bulk of national resources toward that specific path, the American strategy instead relies heavily on fostering genuine competition among multiple private companies, each pursuing meaningfully different technical philosophies, with government evaluation serving primarily to identify and support whichever approaches, demonstrate genuine technical merit through independent, rigorous verification rather than through political or bureaucratic preference. Proponents of this more decentralized approach argue it tends to produce more resilient, more genuinely innovative outcomes over time, since it does not require government officials to correctly predict years in advance which specific technical approach will ultimately prove most successful. A notoriously difficult prediction, even for the most experienced technology experts working directly within the field. Critics of the same approach sometimes counter that it can lead to duplicated effort, slower overall progress, and less efficient allocation of scarce specialized talent and resources compared to a more centrally coordinated national effort, precisely the kind of coordinated approach China appears to be pursuing more directly through its own government-led quantum computing strategy. Understanding why American companies, specifically, not just government officials, feel genuine pressure from this Chinese progress requires appreciating just how central next-generation computing power has become to nearly every major American technology company's long-term strategy. NVIDIA has built an extraordinary position atop the artificial intelligence industry, specifically because its graphics processors have become the dominant hardware powering the current generation of AI systems. If an entirely different computing paradigm, whether genuinely quantum or simply photonic in nature, eventually proves capable of running certain AI workloads dramatically faster and more efficiently, that development could meaningfully reshape the competitive landscape that companies like NVIDIA currently dominate. It is worth noting that NVIDIA itself has been actively investing in similar optical and quantum computing approaches, including reported discussions around investing directly in American quantum computing companies like PsiQuantum, suggesting that even the company currently sitting at the very top of the AI hardware world is taking this potential term position rather than assuming its current dominance is permanently secure. There is a valuable broader lesson embedded in watching how even the most dominant company in a given technology field chooses to respond to a genuinely uncertain, potentially disruptive competing approach. Companies that have achieved truly commanding market positions sometimes fall into the trap of becoming complacent, assuming their current technological advantage is durable simply because it has proven so dominant up until this point. NVIDIA's own leadership has repeatedly emphasized publicly that maintaining long-term dominance in any rapidly evolving technology field requires constantly investing in potential successor technologies, even ones that could theoretically compete with or eventually replace the company's own current core products. That willingness to actively invest in technologies that could disrupt your own existing business model is a genuinely difficult organizational discipline to maintain consistently, and the fact that NVIDIA appears to be doing exactly that with quantum and photonic computing specifically suggests the company's leadership views this Chinese progress and the broader quantum computing race more generally as a genuine long-term competitive threat worth taking seriously today, rather than a distant speculative concern that can safely be ignored for another decade. There's also a broader economic anxiety at play here that extends well beyond any single company's competitive position. American technology companies have spent the past several years pouring truly enormous sums of capital into building out AI infrastructure, largely centered around traditional GPU-based computing architecture. If a fundamentally different computing approach, one that China appears to be investing in aggressively and treating as a top national priority, eventually proves capable of delivering dramatically better performance at a fraction of the energy cost, that could represent a genuine strategic vulnerability for an American technology sector that has bet so heavily on one particular computing paradigm continuing to dominate for years to come. That is precisely the kind of scenario that keeps technology executives and national security officials awake at night, even when the specific claims driving that concern, like a 1,000-fold speed improvement, still require significant independent verification before they should be fully believed. It is also worth acknowledging the genuinely uncertain, almost paradoxical nature of the broader US-China technology relationship playing out in the background of this entire story. American export controls were specifically designed to slow China's access to advanced computing technology, yet some observers have pointed out an ironic possibility buried within that strategy. By restricting China's access to cutting-edge conventional computing hardware like advanced NVIDIA GPUs, Those same export controls may have inadvertently pushed Chinese researchers and companies to invest more aggressively in alternative computing paradigms, including photonic and quantum approaches, precisely because those alternative paths were not directly blocked by the same restrictions targeting traditional semiconductor technology. Whether or not that dynamic has been a deliberate strategic pivot on China's part or simply a byproduct of necessity, it represents exactly the kind of unintended consequence that makes technology policy in this space so genuinely difficult to get right. And it partly explains why some critics argue current restrictions may need to be reconsidered or expanded to more directly address this specific competitive front as well. So where does this leave things right now, with claims still needing independent verification, production capacity still relatively limited, and genuine technical disagreement even among experts about how to properly categorize what ChipX has actually built? The honest answer is that nobody outside of a small circle of specialists currently has complete clarity on exactly how much of a genuine breakthrough this really represents. What is much clearer is the broader pattern this single announcement fits into. China has made quantum technology a top-tier national priority, backed by sustained government investment and a demonstrated willingness to work around American export restrictions, rather than simply accepting them as an insurmountable barrier. The United States has responded with billions of dollars in direct government investment, a rigorous multi-company technical evaluation process run through DARPA, and growing acknowledgement at the highest levels that quantum computing leadership carries real national security implications, not just commercial ones. Individual chip announcements like this one from ChipEx will keep generating headlines, and some of those specific claims will likely get walked back or contextualized once independent researchers get a proper chance to examine them closely. But the underlying competitive dynamic driving genuine concern among American companies and policymakers is not going away anytime soon, regardless of how any single announcement eventually holds up under scrutiny. If this breakdown helped you understand what is actually happening in the escalating quantum computing race between the United States and China, go ahead and hit that like button. And subscribe if you want more deep dives covering exactly this kind of high-stakes technology competition as it continues to unfold. What do you think about all this? Does a claim like this, thousand-fold speed improvement, genuinely worry you about America's long-term technological position? Or do you think the skepticism from critics pointing out quantum computing's narrow, specialized usefulness is the more reasonable read on this specific announcement? Let me know your honest take in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of story where the eventual truth probably sits somewhere between the most alarming headlines and the most dismissive skepticism, and I would genuinely love to hear which direction you lean. It is also worth remembering that stories like this one rarely resolve themselves quickly. Expect follow-up reporting, independent technical analysis, and likely some walked back or clarified claims over the coming months as researchers outside of ChipX itself get genuine opportunities to examine and test these systems more thoroughly. That slower, more methodical process of verification is far less exciting than a single dramatic headline, but it is ultimately the only reliable way any of us will eventually learn how much of this specific announcement turns out to be genuine technological breakthrough versus ambitious marketing dressed up in scientific language. Zooming out, this story is really just one visible data point inside a much larger technology competition that has been quietly intensifying for years, largely outside the notice of most casual observers. Semiconductor manufacturing, artificial intelligence infrastructure, and now quantum computing have all become deeply intertwined fronts in a broader strategic competition between the world's two largest economies, one where the stakes extend well beyond corporate profits and stock prices into genuine questions of national security, military capability, and which country ultimately sets the technological standards the rest of the world ends up building on top of. Individual announcements, whether from ChipX in China or from companies like Microsoft and PsiQuantum here in the United States, will keep arriving at a rapid pace over the coming years. Understanding the broader competitive context behind each of those announcements, rather than reacting only to the most dramatic-sounding headline, is exactly what separates genuine understanding of where this technology race is actually heading, from simply getting swept up in whichever claim currently sounds the most impressive. Thanks for watching this entire breakdown. If you want to stay ahead of stories like this one, covering exactly where global technology competition is heading next, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because there is a lot more unfolding in this space than most headlines ever fully capture. One final thought worth carrying with you after watching this. Technology races of this scale rarely get decided by a single dramatic announcement. No matter how impressive or alarming that announcement initially sounds, they get decided gradually through years of sustained investment, repeated engineering iteration, and the slow accumulation of practical, real-world applications that either validate or quietly undermine the bold early claims that generated the initial headlines. Right now, both the United States and China are making that sustained long-term bet simultaneously, pouring billions of dollars and years of specialized engineering talent into a technology whose ultimate practical impact still remains genuinely uncertain even to the experts working directly on it every single day. Whoever eventually gets it right first will not just win a single news cycle. They will likely shape the underlying computing infrastructure that the rest of the global economy ends up building on top of for decades to come, which is exactly why announcements like this one from ChipX, however uncertain their ultimate significance turns out to be, are worth paying close attention to, rather than dismissing outright or accepting entirely at face value.